Richard Edward Bosco.
And my uncle Kenneth Joseph Marino, who was a firefighter with FDNY Rescue 1 in Manhattan. He was one of the first responders on that day. I am 12 years old, so I never met my Uncle Kenny, but I feel like I know him from my parents, grandparents, and family members. One thing I learned is that my Uncle Kenny and I share a love of baseball. Our favorite player is Ken Griffey Jr., and I'm very happy and proud that we have the same interests. But most important is that my Uncle Kenny was a true hero. He saved many lives on that day. Our family misses him every day, and we will never forget his memory or his bravery.
Always one of the more emotional parts of this annual ritual, hearing survivors read off the names of the 3,000 victims that day. Several hours the ceremony goes on every year, obviously on this day there in Lower Manhattan. We were in there talking. If you've never been to that memorial, it is still almost a quarter century later. It gives you chills, and you walk back into that dark moment, and they did a beautiful job, building and constructing that. People still flock to it, even beyond on this anniversary day. But it's such a beautiful and always moving tribute to the nearly 3,000 people we lost that day. And that little boy never knew his uncle.
And there are so many stories like that where, a child was 1 when this happened, or 3. And so when you think back to your earliest memories, and that's your father, you may never remember.
Right.
And so it's, or your mother, sister, whatever it is, your relation, it's heartbreaking.
From big picture and little picture, like people of a certain age will never remember what it was like to go to the airport, and even if you weren't flying, go to the gate with the person who was flying.
Yeah, not have to take your shoes off.
Shoes and belt, and
security.
TSA didn't exist. Department of Homeland Security didn't exist. It did, without a drop of hyperbole, it did change the country. But bigger picture, I think, for many of us, I was only 23 when it happened, but it shattered your sense of this is America, and we are secure, and we have we lost that day, to understand there are parts of the world that hate us so much, they're capable of that kind of evil.
When you saw the plane hit the tower, I almost thought, like, this is make-believe. This is this has to be a movie or something that I'm watching on my screen, and it took, I could not believe it when it actually happened.
And in no way, I was 9 when this happened, in no way can you conceptualize what this really means, but I will never forget, we had a family friend who worked at the World Trade Center, and we could not find her. And we went to my family friend's home that lived around the corner from us, and I'll never forget seeing her walk through the door covered in ash, and just her kids were my age and my sister's age, who's just a couple years younger than I am, and the agony that her husband was in all morning long, waiting. And at the time, we had no idea what was going on as kids, and what it would mean. And when I say ripple effects, you mentioned one of them, but just the feeling of security and the feeling of safety that so many adults knew what that meant in that moment. And I just thought my friend's mom may not come home, and how devastating that alone was. But it was a sad day, and you remember exactly where you were when you heard what happened. You remember the details. I was in class, and I got taken out of class.
It all stopped. No, again, it changed everyone and everything about our country for forever. National political correspondent Alex Miller is there in Lower Manhattan at Ground Zero as the ceremony continues for the next few hours as we remember the victims. Alex, good morning to you.
Well, good morning. We are inside 7 World Trade Center, which was another building that was destroyed on that day 23 years ago. And I'm always struck when I'm down here on this day, or really any time that I'm down here, how beautiful and pristine and rebuilt this entire area was. But just to give you an idea of how close this all still is, I'm hearing the names, and I've talked to so many of the family members that have already been named. And that little boy that you just heard from talking about his Uncle Kenny, the story you're about to hear, that was that girl's dad. So you can just see how much the ripple effect continues to happen here, and just how many generations continue to be impacted by this day.
Kristen Marino, her mother and baby brother made a quick detour on the way to a Tuesday appointment in Manhattan on September 11th, 2001. They decided to surprise her father, Kenneth, at his firehouse in Lower Manhattan.
He put me and my brother was 1, I was 3 at the time, on the fire truck, which was the same fire truck that literally got crushed an hour or like a little bit afterwards.
Just minutes after arriving to the appointment, they were told to leave the city immediately. 2 planes had hit the Twin Towers. They eventually recovered Kenneth's helmet and Halligan, but never him.
My mom got out of the car and literally watched the tower just crumble. She said it kind of hit her when she was watching the news and she saw Rescue 1's truck underneath all the rubble.
Nearly 40% of the people believed to have died on 9/11 have still not been identified. There is a place at Ground Zero for the families to see scientists still combing through the rubble to try to find anything to identify their loved ones. A place of such catastrophe has transformed for some to one of solace.
I feel like almost like a sense of peace, which is weird in an environment that you would think that like would be so traumatic. I actually feel peace because I know that my dad is there in my mind. Like that's his gravesite. Like that's where I go to see him and feel like his presence.
Marino used to avoid coming to the city, avoid speaking about her dad.
I would just bawl my eyes out because I just couldn't process it for the longest time.
Now she's done a 180. She finds comfort in the city, and she's brought his story to social media.
I started to realize, like, in my comments, like, I was helping people, and I was like, oh, wow, like, I lived through this, maybe to help other people that are going through loss or trauma.
She's been able to connect with others who lost parents to terrorism, including across the world on October 7th, even appearing in a documentary about it. These connections, she says, have given her a new way to heal and appreciate what her dad gave.
I'm just ultimately just proud of him. He's my hero, and I know that must have been the hardest sacrifice ever, is running into those buildings not knowing.
And guys, just taking the subway down here, getting off, walking the same path that so many of those people likely walked on that day. There was a certain eerie calm here this morning, seeing all the police officers around. The sky looks very similar to what it did that day. It's a beautiful fall day down here. This area is completely packed with family members here to show their respects. And we're going to continue to see those moments of silence again at 9:37 this morning when the plane hit the Pentagon, and then again at 10:02 this morning when the plane crashed into the ground at Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The families will be here likely into the afternoon, reading all of those names and just making sure that their loved ones are remembered on this day. I mean, it is such an incredible thing to imagine that still all of these years later, 40% of these people have not been identified. And so this is really the moment, the gravesite for so many of these people to be there to honor their loved ones.
Think about that stat.
Yeah.
40%, nearly half not identified 23 years later. That tells you just the nature of what happened that day. It's hard to get your mind around that.
National political correspondent Alex Miller in New York for us this morning. Thank you, Alex.
Don't forget that plane that she just talked about was the one that went down to Shanksville, destined for the White House.
Right.
Until
those passengers
fought back. Yep.
Yeah.
Let's roll.